What's up, guys? We are on 2.11. We're looking at forced and voluntary migration. Almost done with this unit. So for today, our objective and essential learning describe different types of forced and voluntary migration. So today we're going to go through these types of forced migration as well as these voluntary migrations. So voluntary migration is just when people might decide to migrate on their own. There's no push, right? Or they might have push factors that make them decide to leave, but it's that voluntary step. They don't have to leave. Involuntary, people relocate due to fears of violence or survival. So we're going to take a look at a few examples and categories here. So for voluntary migration first, this includes transnational, transhumanist, internal, chain, step, migration, as well as guest workers and rural to urban migration. So also if we think about Ernst Ravenstein's laws of migration, whenever you see this little R, that means that we see this, one of his laws, right, at play. So first, transnational migration. This is migration from one country to another country. So across borders, across national borders. Immigrants to a new country retain strong cultural, emotional, and financial ties to their country of origin, right? I think maybe a lot of y'all will be able to relate to this. You know I relate to this. I love my home. I love Mission, Texas, right? Strong ties. Also remittances. A lot of people who move internationally will send money back to their home country, to their families. So that money that gets sent back to their home country, they're called remittances. So this is a major economic flow of money. And we do see this happening quite a bit, right? In the previous video, we saw the example of the bracero program. With that guest worker program, a lot of the braceros sent money back to Mexico to their families. So three major flows of migration. We see Latin America to North America. We also see Southwest Asia into Europe, and then also like North Africa, right? And then Asia to North America, which isn't really exactly labeled on here, but that's another major flow. Then we have internal migration. So these are migrants that travel within a country's borders. They're much more likely to be internal migration than transnational migration. It's a lot harder to move across national borders. There's a lot more barriers to it. It's a lot more expensive. So most people who move within their same country or even their same smaller locality. So distance decay, if we think about that term, the further apart two places are, the less likely people will migrate between those places. So the example, and we can see the image here, the Rust Belt to Sun Belt migration in the US after World War II. So this area was considered the Rust Belt. And then in the South, that was considered the Sun Belt because it's sunnier. We saw like a huge migration flow out to that area. So the push factors were that these factories closed in the industrial Northeast and Midwest. Once those factories closed, people needed jobs, and then they were more open to moving. Pull factors to these Sunbelt area, low taxes, inexpensive land, and nice weather, as in it's nice and warm. Then we have transhumanist migration. This is traditional migration of nomadic herders that move their livestock, typically from like higher elevations where it's cooler in the summer to lower elevations where it's warmer in the winter. We see this in Europe and Africa, and this is an example here that we see in like sub-Saharan Africa. So next we have chain migration. Immigrants migrate to a location based off a recommendation of their family member, or maybe to reunite with family members, friends, and other people who are from their home region. The knowledge and the experience of these people who've literally gone before them help them, and they tend to follow that same pathway, right? That same origin to the same destination. So it creates like that chain. Then step migration. A lot of migration does occur in steps before reaching the final destination, especially because there might be intervening opportunities or intervening obstacles. So that can set people back, or it can just kind of like delay them. So one example is a rural area to a city, and then a larger city, and then a big metropolis. So if somebody goes from a farm to a town to a city to like a metropolis, then we see like that progression over time. And again, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention, this is one of Ernst Ravenstein's laws of migration. Then rural to urban migration. This is the most typical type of migration that we see. We have about 55% of people that live in urban areas globally today. In Europe and North America, it's like the vast majority. We see economic push and pull factors. So basically jobs and economic opportunities are far more available in cities than they are in rural areas. So that's a huge draw for people. And again, this rural to urban migration is one of Ernst Ravenstein's laws. Then we have guest workers. So these are people who travel internationally. Typically, this is arranged between the two governments to have guest worker programs. And then they find work as temporary laborers. Usually these are short periods of time because these jobs aren't able to be filled by the country's own workforce. So let's say like construction work, areas that are needing to build like big projects all of a sudden, then that might be extended to guest workers, or if there's some sort of shortage. Moving on to involuntary migration. So we see refugees, internally displaced persons, and asylum seekers, and enslaved people who are considered not involuntary migrants. So first we have refugees. I don't know if you could hear Addie crying. He's so desperate for attention right now. So we have refugees. These are people who've been forced to flee their home country because of persecution, war, or violence. Typically, these causes war, ethnic, tribal, religious violence, and then also environmental disasters. That's another category of refugee, like a climate refugee. 68% of refugees come from 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Now, this is like a couple years old, so I'm not quite sure where Ukraine falls into this, but they definitely in Europe have like a significant presence. And then this map right here is as of 2017, refugee population by country or territory of origin. So here we can see like where we have a lot of where migrants are from, right? Where these refugees are from. Then internally displaced persons. So this is almost the same as a refugee, except they have not crossed their national border. They're still within their home country, but they are still displaced. They still have the same issues as refugees, the same reason for leaving as refugees. So large groups of internally displaced persons, or IDPs, are located in Colombia, Syria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Yemen. And then we have asylum seekers. This is when people will leave their own country and then seek sanctuary to be protected in another country. So there are like legal protections. So refugees do tend to try to apply for asylum. Sometimes where they decide to go will be countries that they know are more open to asylum seekers and more open to refugees. You guys, Addie's looking so cute right now. And then enslaved persons. So historically, the Atlantic slave trade is probably the biggest example of this. So this happened during like the era of colonization, and it's estimated that 10 to 12 million people were enslaved and forced to work in the New World. Now we have enslaved people still, unfortunately. The UN says that there's about 21 million people who are enslaved. A lot of times you might hear the term human trafficking. that's talking about enslaved people. So we see this in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different forms. So this is absolutely probably the epitome of involuntary migration. And that is it for 2.1. And